Today is June 8th, 2015. I'm Adrienne Falaise, and it is my honor to be conducting part 3 of our interview with Matthew Weiner for the Archive of American Television, and we're here at his home in Los Angeles, California. So we last spoke with you right after season 4 of Mad Men had aired, and then there was about a 1.5-year gap between season 4 and 5. So tell us a little bit about what happened in between there.
There wasn't a 1.5-year gap in terms of production. Mm-hmm. But what happened is the order of things is hard for people to understand because it was handled, a lot of it played out in the press. But the fact is that AMC decided that they wanted to delay the show. And now that they've split the final seasons, I think people are not as incredulous about this. And they've gone on the record with all of it, but it's impossible to undo at this point. So they wanted to delay the show to stagger it so that it would come on later and that Breaking Bad could go on during the summer. In that spot, which was obviously very good for Breaking Bad and was a good strategy. In that time, as they were delaying, my contract expired, and they were supposed to negotiate with me, and Lionsgate and AMC were having their own negotiations over video on demand, which was something that didn't really exist when the show started. So anyway, it became contentious and so forth, and in the heat of this negotiation, they publicized that they couldn't reach an agreement with me and they're going to delay the show. And that was not true. And it was done to make me look bad and, to play an individual against a corporation. And I think it did. But in the end, they apologized and, I welcome the chance to explain that. That's not my version. That's really what happened. And at the time, people were like, why would they delay the show? And now you see that was not a bad idea to push so that they wouldn't have them both in the same quarter every year. Mm-hmm. And also, so what happened was I think it was in April, when it was finished, when the negotiation was done, and I've gone on the record already about, how contentious it was and how I had to quit and what the issues were involved, which was, none of which had to do with money. Nothing had to do with money. I, obviously wanted to participate financially in the show, but that was not any part of my ask. What the ask was from them was for a blanket, product placement whenever they wanted it, which I would never agree to cut the cast, which was tough because their contracts expired, for season 5. So they wanted to avoid the chance that a contract that they'd signed at the beginning, and they had gotten pay raises, and I thought that they were being taken care of, but I knew that they were going to get a big pay raise if the show went into 5, 6, and 7. And they knew that too, and they wanted me to get rid of some of the people, quite a few actually. And the other thing that was really the biggest problem, believe it or not, was that they wanted me to cut the running time of the show down by 2 minutes so that they could add more commercials. In the end, the solution to that was just to run it past the hour. They don't have any other shows. It would run into itself, basically, because they play it 3 times in a row on Sunday night. They had no other shows on the network at all running at that time. I mean, I don't mean like a different night or anything. There was just starting up, to have another show that wasn't running, because ours is 13 weeks, so they would have them one at a time. Everything else was purchased programming, repurposed reruns, whatever you want to call it. So I was not going to do any of that. And in the end, I didn't have to do any of it. And I did get paid, which was very exciting. And I got to keep all of my actors, and they got paid. And then we had an agreement to do 36 more episodes, which when they told me that they were going to split the last season, and they told me at the time, I was like, I need to have, it's not 36, 39, excuse me, it's 3 seasons. If you're going to split it, I can't do a 6-episode season. It's too few. So I added another one, so it'd be 7 and 7. I didn't know there'd be a year in between those 2 seasons. I thought they were going to run them the way that The Sopranos ran their last 2 seasons, which was like one in the spring and one in the fall. But, and the measurement of how long things are and how long the season was and all these other things, it's hard to explain, but as involved as I am, at a certain point, ever since season 2, when I suggested that they have a rerun on the evening of the Emmys, because we had a big audience that would be watching the Emmys, and I didn't want to drive people to the TV, but whatever. I just suggested they had a rerun. And they said, we want to do any reruns because the ratings will drop after that. It takes a while to build them back up again when you have a repeat. People don't know, and then whatever. And they still did it, and they were completely right. And other than moving to Sunday night, I have had almost no input into the actual programming of the show. I kind of have to say, and I don't say a lot of things like this about the network, but they really know their business in terms of this, and I don't. I just make it. So that's what happened. So when we did go back on the air, we went back into production right away, but they didn't air it for a while. So the gap, I don't think it really is 16 months. I'm not sure, but it might be 16 months from the end of one to the end of the other. But I think in terms of like when the last episode aired to when the next one premiered, I think it's only about 11 months.
Yeah.
But whatever it is, it's a long time. And we were done with the entire season when we went on the air. And I knew when we came back that I wanted to make a splash because I felt there'd been this negative publicity and we'd been off the air for so long. And there also was a really strong reaction to Jessica Paray's character, Megan Draper. And people were wondering if they were really going to get married because he had proposed to her at the end of it. And I just said, let's move ahead in time. We'll move ahead in time. I think we moved ahead in time about the amount of time that had passed, which I've done a few times in the show. And Zooby Zooby Zoo, that was going to be the premiere. And when I started writing it, it just started getting longer and longer and longer. It was one of those things. And someone goes, oh, why don't we make a two-parter out of it? Which is always what you do when you're like too lazy to cut something down. And I was like, I'm not making a two-parter out of it unless there's more story. So Andre and Maria in particular, or Andre actually, I think, Jacques Matan remembered the story that we'd always wanted to do. We were going to actually do it with Pete about finding somebody's wallet in a car. And it sounds like a tiny thing, but it's a way to bring an imagined world into somebody's life. And we knew, the major plot points of season 5 from the beginning when I came back were Don is going to live in this idealized romance with Megan. He really loves her. And who knows if it's, the Lavender Haze, as it's been called, or as actually Vic, who worked on the show, told the expression about love leave. And he had been in advertising, love leave. And I loved that. That Don would basically have his wife at work. Their relationship, business-wise, was very shaky. She never knew if she was working for him or with him. Nobody else knew how, even though she was really low on the totem pole, she really had access to him. And all of the confusion that went with that, and he didn't even care. Because, as I said, the theme of season 5 is that Don and Megan are one person, and that person is Don. So that when Megan realizes after succeeding that she doesn't want to do this, it's a deep blow to him. He supports her, but it's really kind of the end of the relationship. Roger says in the premiere that they're all great till they want something. And I always felt that Megan was the first modern woman on the show and we did everything we could to point that out. She's choosing what she wants to do. And, Don and Roger are like, I didn't choose what I wanted to do, like the whole idea of a profession. And I really enjoyed, we were telling that story. These were the basic points. It was kind of about, I'm trying to remember the season in general, but I remember there was obviously Joan and Jaguar. That was a big part of it. And Lane's suicide. Everything was about Lane's suicide. And the story was going to be that they were going to be struggling and struggling and struggling and struggling. And then with patience, they would make a ton of money. But what would happen on the way there? What were the compromises on the way there? And Pete and Don switched lives, which was a really interesting story to tell. There's a lot of emotion that season, a lot of loss, and a lot of compromise. And all the way working its way to the end where I had this You Only Live Twice sequence in mind with the song and with the images, which particularly ended with a woman saying, "Are You Alone?" and Don looking up and not answering. So you'd know that he had reached full circle. But his loss of Megan would be mid-season, and that would be a deep wound. And the other thing that started over the break, once I knew the show was happening, is I went and I continued my 4-year-long campaign to get a Beatles song in the show. And I mean, I think if we're talking here for the archive, that was a significant moment for the show and for TV, because they have not been on television. There are now, people have to understand, the Beatles actually singing one of their songs hadn't been on TV other than their special, like All You Need Is Love or Magical Mystery Tour. You've seen, the sort of be-in that they did. And they really didn't want to be on TV, and you could buy versions of their songs they're called covers, with other people singing them, and we had done that before also. Or instrumental versions of Do You Want to Know a Secret, things like that. But I finally had a conversation with Jeff Jones, who runs Apple Records, and speaks for the Beatles, and we went in there, and I told him what year it was, and he said, "So what do you want, 1966?" And I'm like, "Tomorrow Never Knows." And he goes, "That's the song," like that. I mean, so we had never met, but there was an agreement right there that I understood their music and knew how to use it, and I said, "And I will make it a major story point." And so it became a symbol. For me, it's a symbol creatively of the fact that the Beatles were so successful at that point and still taking all these risks. It was very inspiring to me. Not that we were as successful as the Beatles, but that I love the fact that in the midst of their incredible world domination, that they were still pursuing musical avenues that were unexpected to the audience and challenging the audience. And for Don, I think a lot of people took this as him being out of touch. And there are certainly things that he seems to, in his lack of interest in his work, that he does seem out of touch. But it wasn't about being old. It was about, I was in love with my wife and was whistling, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." And now I'm listening to this song about surrendering to the void. So, and it's right in the middle of the season. So that's season 5.
Now, Betty also has a cancer scare in season 5.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so Betty's cancer scare. So it's worth saying now that it's over that I always knew that Betty would die, would contract lung cancer. And it was something that I kind of I talk about harvesting storylines, that from the beginning, her mother died right before the show started, very young. And Betty has a sense of tragedy about her. But what happened was that I actually had a relative who had this thyroid cancer, and his joke was, "I got the only cancer that makes you fat." And what I loved, I know it's funny, but he survived, he's fine. But what I really wanted to do was deal with the real life thing, that when I called all the actors up, January in particular, and said, "Hey, the contract thing worked out, we're going back to work," January said, "I'm pregnant." And she goes, "I hope that's not a problem." And we had delayed, and I was like, I'm going to get up and running the minute I can, but what are we going to do? And Betty had it built in that she had a weight problem as a child. I always felt that her merciless criticism of other people had to do with her own sort of mother and the criticism from her mother. This is all out of character. I know it sounds like I'm talking about a fake person, but this is really how we think about the story.
Yeah.
And when I say we, this is a lot of people. But this problem I kind of solved on my own and ran it past January. And I was like, what if, in the time that's passed, with her with her husband marrying this, believe it or not, Betty's already younger than Don. Now he's married this much younger woman, and she got married first and she dumped him, but now that he's found Megan and they work together and everything, this is a huge threat for her. And in this moment, she gains weight. And that was a big commitment, story-wise. And we got the best prosthetic makeup people we could get. And we had done this with Elizabeth the first season, but it was a little bit different because January's actually pregnant. So there are health concerns about all of the chemicals that are involved in this, not that there weren't with Elizabeth. And I don't know how to explain it, but we made Elizabeth look pregnant, and now we had to make January just look heavy. And John Hamm directed the first episode of the season. It's not the premiere, but we got January's work in early because I knew she was going to have. She didn't want to work up to the minute that she was having the baby. She wanted like 6 weeks before, which I totally understood. And we just, it was hot, really hot, and I felt that this was her deep blow to her confidence, and that's how it was expressed, and completely believable. I can tell you from not just my own experience, but everybody in the writers' room, everybody was like, "This would totally happen. It's a great solution. She's not going to have to walk around with a basket in front of her." The funny thing is January, even pregnant, really didn't put on that much weight, so we kind of really had to overdo it. And then we have this slightly heavy woman, Pauline, who plays, it's not the actress's name, but Henry's mother, who is obviously becomes a character right from the beginning of season 4, actually. You meet her and realize Henry's relationship with her at Thanksgiving. And I love the fact that Betty would go through this experience of the jealousy. And I love the idea that jealousy, I came into it with this from the season, and I don't know why it was on my mind, but it's one of these sort of like aha moments you have, that jealousy actually, of course, that as a person, when you're jealous, it can consume you and destroy you. It's definitely a negative emotion. It can color everything. You reek of negativeness that can affect everything, and I believe that. But I also believe that being the subject of jealousy can destroy you also. Not in some cosmic way, but that you can attract sort of negative feelings, and it can influence you. And we tried to do that, and we actually did an episode about it, which is one of my favorites we've ever done, which is Dark Shadows, when Betty goes to pick up the kids and sees Megan getting dressed, and sees their apartment, and tells Sally that she wasn't the dad's first wife. She spills the beans on that. And of course, the kids are dealing with a divorce, but those kind of, for people who have questions about how the show works, like how the plot works, that's a perfect example. It's just, it's that, I'll explain it. It's not like a plot that you've heard before. Mm-hmm. It's just something that's drawn from life.
So when you are plotting out the show, do you start with stories or themes, or what's the process?
Themes are something that you'd like to have on your mind. You'd like to tell the world that that's how it works, but it's really kind of the Parmesan cheese on the spaghetti. And what I believe, and I experienced this from watching David Chase work and from writing for him, that if something is on your mind, it'll be in your work. So a theme is kind of like whatever that gut thing that you can't control that works. Now, I have amazing help on the show, which I talk about. One of the things that Maria was really good at, and Semi as well, and a lot of the writers, but Maria was the second in charge. Maria and Andre were second in charge that season, is figuring out which stories go together in an episode. And anybody can assemble a theme from that. This is basically how the theme works in an episode, is you start thinking about the story and say, like, well, is this about powerlessness? Is this about, how do we show that Don's really in love with this woman, with Megan, that it's not, a dalliance or something, first of all, I think it was a shock to the audience when he revealed that she knew everything about him. He's wearing a blue shirt. He's trying to be that guy. And the whole time I kept thinking, like, she's so much younger than him, it's going to make him insecure. And then everyone's like, I don't think you understand that a man who looks like that, who's that age, who has money, it's just like, he's never at the bottom of anything. He will never be at the bottom of anything. No matter what happens, he will never be out of touch. Touch will come to him. And we started looking at Playboy, for example, or some men's magazine with idealized men in it, and they're all these, Roger Sterling types with neckties, and they're not looking all hip and groovy or anything yet, and even later on, they're not looking that way. And they're sitting there with 25-year-old women on their lap. They are still the most desirable part of the population. So doing something where Don says to Megan, you're young, and her saying, so I've never experienced death? That would she be raising his kids if something happened? How permanent is this relationship? Are they thinking beyond the future? And the work thing, of course, very important, because he's not her dad. But when you start doing something like Lane and you have to set up, the Jaguar dealership, then you get really good things out of it. I came into the writer's room, and we'd always been talking about Lane killing himself, and I always wanted him to hang himself in his office because we'd heard this story about someone doing this, and that the door wouldn't open, and that they were in there. And then, of course, nobody wanted to be in the office. And yes, we'd had Miss Blankenship die in the office, but this was a thing that was somebody we really knew. And I came in there and they said, what if he tries first to kill himself in his garage? And then we had this whole thing about trying to find an apartment with a garage in New York City, because they really don't have them, believe it or not. Not in the pre-war Tudor Village place that we had put him, a particular neighborhood that we said Lane was in, that only we knew about. I don't think the audience ever sensed this. Tudor City he lived in, near the UN. And they said, I think actually that came first, that he would try. I actually thought that he should maybe do it in the garage. But anyway, they came out with the joke that the car doesn't start, because everyone knew that this was the big problem with that X-type Jaguar. And the Jaguar itself became the symbol of this, the low-level entry car that's high prestige but not enough business. The stepping stone philosophy of advertising, where you get a little piece of something and you can build it into something else. This is why Don was going to Dow. It's like you want this business to succeed, and they've sort of made it, but they are just barely making ends meet, to the point where you'll watch the drama happen with the Christmas bonuses, for example, with people having to put their own money in to keep the company, right, going. It all happened one piece at a time. And really what it is that you have the ending and you start working your way back. And then you have certain scenes you want to do, We knew that we had that staircase, and they finally had a second floor that we wanted Pete to fall down the steps. I knew it. We worked looking for a story where Pete could fall down the steps. The Pete and Lane fight, believe it or not, that story starts with Lane's frustration, Pete and Don having switched lives. We see him on the train in the opening episode. Lane's dissatisfaction, as we see when he has this romance with this owner of the wallet's girlfriend. And we see people sort of not paying attention to their material needs, which to me is always the tension in the show. There's a theory, and obviously a very famous theory, I think it's Maslow, who says that when your material needs are met, you start thinking this is when your spiritual needs become an issue. If you have food and shelter, then you start thinking about, religion and satisfaction and psychological issues, which I don't even know is really true, because Karl Marx thinks it's the exact opposite, actually. He thinks that people who have no material benefits are the most religious. So who knows what it is, but I like to play with it, and I know that it's an issue. And Pete not being able to drive and having to live out in the country and having a midlife crisis of sorts, and seeing this young, fresh girl and sort of playing the older man to her, and not having a shot. He doesn't even know he doesn't have a shot. And then going and get, beaten at work. I mean, it's a very dark episode that talks about people's aspirations beyond where they are. Ken's writing, his wife reveals his writing, and Roger punishes him for that. That's episode 5. You talk about themes for a season, that's where they are. They're also there in Tea Leaves. They're also there in A Little Kiss, both parts of it. It's a very rich season that I'm very proud of, actually, and it was without. I mean, yes, Lane dies, but it really, really put drama into the battle of money versus life. Lane's suicide, Joan's, prostitution. I haven't thought about that too. That I actually believe that whole storyline, of which has been documented, I think, quite a bit, how a very serious story problem was solved. And I always use it because people ask me how the writers' room works, and it's a great example, which is that I wanted Don to give this incredible pitch for Jaguar, and we had to build in the whole Jaguar pitch. The amount of work that went into the getting the right, but just Josh Weltman, Bob Levinson, getting the Vic Levin, who also had been in advertising, getting the sort of rudimentary stages of like actually showing the creative process the way we did with the Relaxicizer, and we do a lot on the show. We don't want to make it boring, but you want to show all the roads that you go down that don't go anywhere, and the inundation that's required, and the amount of stuff that the prop department and set tech had to get to really make the agency look like they were on a charrette, which is the all-night, creative, like no sleep, whatever. And them getting the car or not getting the car was not the issue, but I knew that there was this pig that was at the Dealers Association, and no one has ever come up to me and said the car business is any different than the way we have portrayed it in the show. General Motors, nobody. No one's ever said, "Oh my God, I can't believe you did that." Everybody in the car business and in the advertising business has been like, "Yep, they were the kings of the roost," and no one knows if the franchisors are the ones controlling it, but all of the attitudes were right, and a lot of that was because Josh Weltman and Bob Levinson had both worked on car accounts, and it had not changed. Josh has given me one of my favorite lines, which was when Peggy was doing the weight loss thing. I was like, I don't know what the strategy would be for a weight loss device. And he goes, "It's before and after pictures since the dawn of time." And I was like, there are certain things that you don't realize as an observer, but that's the way it is. It's just like, you go into a restaurant and the director 90% of the time will start on a tray with a waiter and take you through the thing. It's just like the way it's done. You could try and mix it up, but that's the way it's done. So having our fake campaign in place, I wanted Don to have this killer pitch that was really about, you have everything, what else do you want? How do you sell something to someone who has everything? Why do they want it? Because no one else has it? Or because they want to confirm the fact that they could have anything? Or because it's so beautiful that you want to really have it? And it became kind of a mystery advertising-wise for me, because it's not a good ad unless it's specifically that thing. Telling somebody rich that you can own anything is not a strategy. Why do I need to own that one? But anyway, this pitch, we realized if Joan slept with this guy and got this partnership, and the public nature of it, it was a fascinating episode to talk about in the room, forgetting about what it did for the, it was one of the most talked about things. We had a couple of water cooler moments. It was kind of the last season of the show too, where not everybody had the TiVo. So you really would the Zooby Zooby Zoo thing was like the song climbed the charts, it was like #1 in the world music chart, Jessica's version of the song. Things like that you really can't get on a TV show anymore now that people are watching it on their own time. Lane's suicide was a big surprise, obviously, and this Joan episode, Pete and Beth, was a big deal. The Beatles song, all these things sort of got a kind of press attention via the audience because of this massive blogging thing that had started to happen, and because the audience was still pretty much watching it within days of each other. But Don's pitch was ruined by the fact that Joan had slept with this guy, so why would you even listen to it? And I came in there and Semi explained Semi Chellis explained this flashback structure. Maria had Semi pitch it. Semi's not great at pitching. Maria is amazing at it. Let's put it that way. Semi is good at pitching, and Semi did end up running the room in season 7. And she's a great writer, but there was something about people pitching their own ideas. And Maria is such a great salesperson for me in terms of distilling things. It's very hard to hear an idea like that, believe it or not. You have to really sit there And not because it's not yours, but because it's complicated to describe, but not complicated to watch. And this whole idea of a flashback happening and Don trying to stop her and Don going in and why Don wanted to win Jaguar and why he didn't want her to sleep with the guy. It wasn't just because he's so virtuous and he's the knight in shining armor. He wants to win it. He doesn't need any help. It's hard for people to understand that, but the man has a really big ego. So that was one of these things where when they told it to me, I was just like, that is amazing. We've done flashbacks in the show before, but I had a long, and you can check the tapes on this, but a long argument with AMC, one of the biggest ones I ever had, about the finale of the first season, The Wheel. That when Don comes in and puts his hat on and asks for the family, and then you see him go and see the family, and then you come back and realize that it's all happened in his mind, right? There was a big argument from the network when they read the script that the audience would not understand this. And I was like, it doesn't work on the page because it's a flashback, but the hat will tell you you're in the same place. And so I put in as many of these gestures as I could, right down to the fact that Joan is taking off the necklace that Herb Rennet gave her when Don knocks on the door. So like all of the consistencies are there. And the audience gets this delightful aha, but it also allowed for you to really understand, and Tom Wilson cut that episode so beautifully, and Phil Abraham directed it. It's just like everything was hitting on all cylinders. Chris Manley did a great job with the cinematography. Actually, I think that Don Devine shot that because Chris was shooting a Lane Suicide episode. He might have been in prep. But all I can tell you is that it's one of those things where it was not the focus of the season. It was just one element of talking about what you will do for money. And it ended up being, to me, just hearing the conversation about it. I put the word prostitution in there. I had Joan say it's prostitution. And I think the Joan and Pete scene is like one of my favorite things we've ever done on the show. And I had pitched it the first day of the season, was Pete's coercion. Pete's sales pitch to Joan. It's kind of appealing in a way. Because also, don't forget, you're in a world with this, who knows if anyone ever watching this will remember, there was a movie called Indecent Proposal that was really big when I was like in college, I think, which was Robert Redford offers Demi Moore $1 million to sleep with him, and her husband, Woody Harrelson, says okay, and they do it. Now it's Robert Redford, not Herb Rennet. No offense to the actor. We deliberately didn't hire Robert Redford for that. But it's still, there is a sexual fantasy, and I reference all of them in the episode. Whether it's Helen of Troy being kidnapped. This is not a rape fantasy, but this is a fantasy about a woman being so desired that a man will go to war or spend a fortune to be with her. And it is prostitution. And once we brought it up, it sounded uglier, but prostitution is, I mean, talk about a theme in the show. It's definitely, sex and work and as currency, that's something we deal with all the time. Mm-hmm. But I really wanted to work up to this moment where Don had slowly separated, and his work, Megan, lowering herself to do a commercial, Megan failing, Megan's mother, paying all of that off along the way was really exciting, actually. And we got to see a lot about advertising that season also. I think the Codfish Ball is that season where Megan really succeeds, where you realize that Megan's Marxist father has said to her, you skipped I'm not saying this as politically, I'm just saying this as a dad. You skipped the whole struggle in life. And something's not right. She's suffering I did not have this plan originally, but someone in the room suggested, I wish I could remember who it was, that Megan should succeed, really, really succeed at advertising. And then decide she didn't want to do it. And so having Stan say something like, why she want to do it, you put in all that effort for what? Heinz baked beans. You know, you're not painting, you know, the Sistine Chapel. It's getting to say that, getting for Pete to explain what a count man does to Emile. The whole sort of success of the group, and what the cost of that is. It's something that people sort of said the show was always about, and it was nice to actually exploit it. Oh, by the way, one more thing about season 5, because I forgot about this. Peggy quitting. You know, that's in the same episode with Joan and the Jaguar thing, and that was something that came from the writer's room. We just kept... I knew that Don did not respect her, and maybe because he made her, and he always saw her, again, as an extension of him. And I felt that, like like the relationship with Megan, that he was going to realize that that was a narcissistic, you know, because she was going to be independent. We played the story slowly, and it's not meant to sound as political as it is, of women's independence. Megan is naturally independent. Peggy has to realize that she has independence. And the reason why I brought it up is because the writer's room came in and said, you know what, she's a loser if she stays with this guy. She's not going to be anything. He treats her terribly. And I was like, I know, but you know, what's she going to do? And she sees he's going through stuff, and they're like, no. So we had a strategy from, you know, with the luxury of knowing that there would be multiple seasons of the show. We knew that we could have her quit, show her working at this other place and succeeding, show her falling in love with her boss, her Don surrogate, the man who was everything Don wasn't to her. Supportive. He's married, but he seems much more virtuous. And I will talk about that structure. But we knew that we had, no matter what, in the middle of season 6, that we were going to have this merger happen. And that would be part of the chaos of the season.
So let's talk a little about season 6 then.
Okay, sure.
So season 6, much like season 1, builds to Thanksgiving in the finale. And Thanksgiving kind of seems to be the prominent holiday. You mentioned we see it in season 4 and season 5, I think.
And it's when the wheel takes place in season 1.
So talk a little bit about building up to Thanksgiving.
You know what? I think that we tried to make every episode a month, and a month apart from each other. Sometimes they aren't. Certainly, like, you know, there are a couple that happen in a row, particularly in season 3, I think, like the Gypsy and the Hobo and the Kennedy assassination, and then, you know, that sort of all, those things are closer together. But, you know, the Kennedy assassination was the week before Thanksgiving. So what happens is we start shooting in April. And I learned this on The Sopranos. Now, granted, we're in Southern California, but you don't want to be that far off from the real weather, because it'll really mess you up. On the other hand, we weren't always shooting in April. And when we came back to start season 4, right after the divorce, I wanted to commit to the fact, because it's interesting. I don't know if this is an originality thing about season 4, and I don't know if I said this before, but it was definitely a problem, which is that doing a story about a divorced man is a very unusual thing. It's so unusual that there really aren't that many examples of it in Western culture, for sure, about a divorced man. It's incredible, right? There's tons about divorced women, but it's just not a topic. And I started realizing, okay, well, there's The Odd Couple, and I started asking friends, like, if you have anything about a divorced man, it doesn't even have to be from the period. Just let me see how people write about this. You know, say anything that dad's divorced. There are plenty of widowed dads and widowed men, but The Sports Writer by Richard Ford, it's very unusual. I've gathered those together, believe it or not. You know, people say things and they're like, no, that guy's separated, he's not divorced. So I wanted to start with Thanksgiving there in season 4, because I thought Don's family really matters to him, no matter what people think. And having to go through the trifecta of Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's as a third party in his children's life will set him up to basically make his way to finding another woman, which is my conclusion, by the way, about why people don't do this story, is because it doesn't last that long. These guys get married right away, which is not always true with women. Women may find somebody, but they may not jump to get married. But men are just like, They got to get the steak on the table, as Don's accountant says. So in season 6, I think that we start actually at New Year's. And what I wanted to do, we had this idea about going to Hawaii for a long time, and we felt that we had, Lionsgate did not agree with us, but we felt that we had earned the right to go and do this brief experience, and I did not want to waste it. I wanted to capture Hawaii of the period, when it was really such a design icon. I can't even explain the impact that Hawaii had. I mean, well, we know it because we live with it, but it might be fading away at this point, but so much, every small town had a, Don the Beachcomber type restaurant. And you could say they're Tahitian or whatever you want to say, but they are Hawaiiana. Hawaii became a state in, I think, in 1957, maybe 55, but people start celebrating it, and mostly after World War II, all these guys came back who had been there. And it's America. So what I wanted to talk about was this was the year where I really wanted to use the history in the show and say, like, we've always talked about events in a thematic sense, like just like an ad campaign. Like, I want to tell a story about Don being alone and his marriage being broken up and the crisis in his identity when he loses his wife. Guess what? Marilyn Monroe died that year. There weren't that many events, by the way, in 1962. I knew we were working our way up to the missile crisis. But with this 1968, and I was like, do I just avoid it? There's so much stuff. But I started reading about what the timeline of events, and I'm saying this as someone who has no recollection of it. This is the turbulent part of the turbulent 60s. And it really is something that we've been working towards, and we never could begin to capture the role that Vietnam played in people's lives. Just conversationally, like, everything is seen in the prism of Vietnam. Everything, whether it's, movie violence, absurdity, anything like that. So what I wanted to do is say, and I'm always fighting this thing, and this does come from reading about the show, because individuals never say this to me, but it's from reading about the show. People, reporters in particular, have latched onto this idea, and I already mentioned it once, that Don is out of touch. That the story is about a man that time is passing by, who is a dinosaur. And I don't feel that at all. I feel like Don's genius is that he is always in touch, because he's not a faddist. He doesn't have an identity. He can become he's like Zelig. He can become any person he is. He listens, he does all of his research personally. He sees every movie, and he's always adjusting, and he won't follow a fad. He won't do a commercial about young people because they told him to do a commercial about young people. He's doing a commercial about want, or what he wants, or what the person he ran into on the plane wants. So season 6 to me was the battle in Don's life between his, Dr. Fay said it, who I am, what I want and what's expected of me. I mean, that's a pretty good topic, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think what I want had won out. And we come back, and if you believe in these things, you don't have to believe in them medically, but they're great for drama, to say that there's an id, a superego, and an ego in a person's mind. And the id is all the dark impulses, the childish impulses, all your desire for, like, everything that comes under the headline of hedonism, right? Everything that hits your pleasure center. And I felt, and that includes violence, by the way. That includes impulsiveness. And I felt that Don had really was going to access that. So doing 1968 and starting it with him in Hawaii and starting with the Inferno and saying, am I alive or am I dead? The Inferno was the perfect book to me because his Italian mistress has given it to him, and who knows why he's reading it. It's like, I knew somebody was having an affair. This guy found out his wife was having an affair because she started watching the World Cup all the time. World Cup soccer, and he's like, I don't know why she got so interested in soccer. It's, it's a tie to your lover. doesn't have to be an affair either. When we get in relationships, we start to love the things that the people we love. So she's given him this book, but of course the beginning of the Inferno is, Dante talking about those lines that Don reads, about being in the middle of his life and saying, oh, I think I took the wrong path. And here I am, I'm about to go through hell, and I'm about to find out who I am. About to have the world laid out to me. And Virgil takes him through it, who he admires. So that setting is like, this is going to be Don's tour through hell. It's going to be America's tour through hell. Because looking at the events, I just kept saying, like, what did people think after Martin Luther King is assassinated? Lyndon Johnson says he doesn't want to run for president. Bobby Kennedy starts saying the most progressive, hopeful campaign you've ever heard. Eugene McCarthy is running for president. He's completely idealistic. You're talking about actual social change. You're seeing revolution all over the world. The Czechs stand up to the Soviets. The students are rioting in Paris. People are protesting for independence everywhere in the world. And then boom, 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 boom. Bobby Kennedy gets shot. You're like, Martin Luther King gets shot. People are like, am I surprised by that? That we're still this low? The rioting, everything is defeated. And I got this idea that, I don't know why, because I know some history, I know that the French Revolution ended with Napoleon, which may not, if you don't know history, all you have to do is understand is that they did everything they could to undo the tyranny of a king and ended up with an emperor. So they obviously, Napoleonic law is slightly, there's more freedom and there's courts and things like that didn't really exist under the monarchy, but they really wanted a monarch in the end after everything. Every provisional government they had was more brutal than the next, and basically whatever the violence that went along with mob rule, they ended up with a king. And that's how I feel about Richard Nixon. That every event of that year that was filled with hope was crushed by violence. In America, it sort of climaxes with the Democratic Convention, if you consider, the assassinations, the undoing, right? There could have been a social revolution. And there's other examples, believe it or not. It's actually happening all over the world. It's happening in Hong Kong. It's happening in Mexico City. It's really kind of shocking. There are certain years like this. 1848 was like that, and that's what Marx was writing about. So it's not a coincidence that people just like can't take it. And when I say people, I mean that the mob actually says, well, why are we putting up with this, and starts taking action. And civilization, good or bad, wins out here, and Richard Nixon ends up as the president at the end. So that story to me was a story of Don and the agency and the chaos that would happen throughout that year. And it's a descent. And that's why the first episode ends with the reveal, almost like the pilot, of Don in an affair. We find out in the pilot that he's married in the last scene. In this one, we find out that he's sleeping with this neighbor. And he says, I don't want to do this anymore. What I want to do and what I'm going to do are two different things. So they end up merging with CGC on an impulse, because Don fires Jaguar on an impulse. This is the season where you see, this is where the Munich thing is. I said it was in season 5. I forgot, I mixed up. This is where Don won't put up with, won't tolerate Herb Rennet, and realizes that he can win by failing. And we see him talking about control. As he loses his control at work, he starts living out his sexual fantasies, and it kind of climaxes, so to speak, in this episode in the middle of the season with Sylvia, called The Man with a Plan, where she's in the hotel room. Again, kind of separates the men from the boys, as the expression would be. I think a lot of people saw this S&M relationship and were horrified by it, and thought that Sylvia was like horrified by Don, but that's not how it was intended. Don the man who hired a prostitute to slap him when he first got divorced. Don, who is clearly into domination in some way and being dominated. This is a sex game that Sylvia is on board with. And when she says it's time to go home, I think the complexity of her religious convictions, right? Which I think was hard for people, but the idea that a Catholic person, on the one hand, sounds totally crazy, but it's true. Suffering brings you closer to God. This is what they tell people when they lose a child or something, believe it or not, is that like, this is a test, but you are in this pain. You are close to God. But also, I think she does want to save him, even though she's breaking the bounds of her marriage and everything. And for Don, the catastrophe is not these assassinations, and it's not even losing his business or losing his interest in his business, and Megan realizing, that he doesn't like working or whatever's going to go on. It's his inability to control his impulses, and whatever, as we find out in the season, that what Sylvia represents, and again, a referential world, not a symbolic world. We know Don's childhood. The whole season was leading to this moment of him revealing where he grew up to his kids. Everybody knows his secret. Betty knows his secret. Megan knows his secret. They know his secret at work. The government doesn't know, thank God. But everybody knows his secret except for his kids, and he never wants them to know. And Sally walking in on him is basically, as it was set up with Grandma Ida, is the cause that he realizes that he has to, getting fired from his job. The Hershey pitch is the moment where he tells the truth to the world, which I always thought, like, this is the big moment. It's Don's going to tell who he is in the middle of a pitch. And then he's going to be truthful to his kids.
We can talk about this last scene of season 6. You directed that as well.
Yes.
That look between Sally and Don at the end
there.
Yeah.
That's one of those things where you, when I think about the events of season 6, we had figured out at this point that whether the audience was on board at the beginning of the show or not, everybody was on board with the cinematic nature of the show. That they knew they had to pay attention, that you couldn't do something else while you were watching it, and that there's a very good chance that something very important would happen when people weren't talking. It doesn't mean that it will always score, but, or when I say score, be communicated, quite honestly. But I feel like most of the emotion that I get is not two people screaming at each other. It's the visual moments of aftermath. It's seeing people in space, in spaces. And I wanted to work up to that moment where he says, this is where I grew up. And of course, him telling her is the big event. But her hearing him is where the emotion is. And when I shot that, it was not simple to shoot because we had to do, I wanted to see the old house in the flashback, and this idea, which I really love. I work with a lot of Catholics. I'm not Catholic, and I'm kind of fascinated by it because Catholicism is like, to me, as a Jewish person, is kind of a more approachable version of evangelical Christianity. I know it's hard to explain, but it's an intellectual interest of mine. And evangelical tradition is what Don is from. So you can always sort of, which is very Old Testament, which is a lot like Judaism. So hearing this idea from the writers, which is very Christian, and that Don would know from his childhood, which is even growing up in a brothel, the only unpardonable sin is the belief that, you can't be forgiven. Do you think you've done something so bad that even God can't see it? And we know that Don, having his daughter walk in on him, that's a big deal. Growing up in that house, seeing him lose his virginity through rape, which was also interesting to hear that people didn't. I remember saying when we were shooting the scene, he's got to say no, make sure it's very clear that he really doesn't want this, whatever his physical reaction is, because she's so sexy, and it's a brothel, and it's a boy losing his virginity. And I said, just imagine it reversed. That's a 25-year-old guy, and that's a 14-year-old girl who keeps saying no. Does that seem any clearer to you? So that was a cultural thing. That was interesting. But I wanted to establish that house and the kind of East of Eden, background that Don has, and what Sylvia means to him. And a lot of these women in his life, when they take speed, you will see him see Moira and say, do I know you? Have we met? There is a kind of woman. And I didn't realize this. Casting pointed this out to me. That I cast January as well, who is not that kind of woman, but most of Don's women have been in a certain physical type. They have dark hair, they're slender, they are usually of some sort of, I guess Abigail Spencer isn't, but they usually, she's probably Irish, but they have like an ethnic identity. It is a kind of person that he is imprinted on. And I loved revealing when he's on speed that it's this woman. And not his mother. And certainly not his stepmother. And so working your way up from this abusive childhood, impoverished background, all the shame of it, all that Hershey represents to Don, the chocolate bar, what he tells in that pitch, which John, to me, is some of the, I've gotten to direct John a lot and worked with him all that time. I never gotten over the performance that he did. That's how it came out, I'd love to take credit for it, writing-wise and directing-wise, but that's really how it came out. And Carly Rae wrote that script with me, and she really understood the whole thing. So anyway, it all builds up to a silent moment. You write those things, and you hope that you can execute them. Jennifer Getzinger did the episode that Semi wrote with Favors, when Don is caught by Sally. And I remember having, when we were doing our, Semi was there when we did the second pass on the script, explaining that Don, after he chases after Sally, that he's in that elevator, he has to be on the verge of collapsing. The shame is so deep. So you mime the gesture and you show it leading, and you don't have to, you can write that. John Hamm knows what it is. No one needs to show him. It's funny because these gestures are kind of drawn from physically observing the actors. And I made the mistake on The Sopranos once of writing in a gesture that Edie Falco did quite frequently, which is that when she was upset, she would touch her stomach, right? And I was on the set, and I said, can you do that thing where you're upset and you rub your stomach? She goes, I don't do a thing. And Edie was totally easy to work with. Like, Edie was always like, just say the line how you want to say it. I'm not intimidated by your acting ability. You're not going to, just tell me how you want it to sound. It's like a line reading, which is a big taboo. And I do it all the time. Sometimes it can mess actors up. That's really the worst part about it. But most of the time it's like, this is how I imagined it. But I remember her saying that. So I was always very careful not to say, you do this thing where you rub your head, where you wipe your eyebrow. And I don't write it in. But John does this thing, which is, for a man like that, it becomes extremely emotional to see him unable to deal with the feelings. So you write them in, and you hope that they happen. And shooting the house before and after at the end was everything. I knew the song, but I couldn't really see it on the monitor. It's so funny because when I first watched it, I was like, that's it? Even when I was shooting it, I'm like, that's it? We just shot some singles? I knew that he had said the line right. And actually, John and I had a disagreement, which he won and he was right about, which was I wanted him to say, this is where I grew up. And he wanted to say, this is where I grew up. And he was right. And we showed it. The editor showed it to me in the rough cut, and Blake McCormick is there, who's a producer in post since the beginning of the show, and is there when I watch all the cuts because sometimes they can be upsetting. They're the least upsetting when I have directed them because I know most of the time what I missed and what I didn't get, so I'm not as shocked at how different it is from how I imagined it. And I was like, did that work? The song was in it and everything. And I look over and he's totally crying, and I'm like, I guess it works. And by the time we had, Chris Gay edited it, had tweaked it a little bit, I remember having one extremely emotional day of watching that, where I was like, and Blake said something amazing, which actually will lead us into the next season in a way. He said, I don't know if this is permanent or anything, but a lot of us never share a look like that with our dad. And I was like, yeah, it's a big life moment. And we built it up as much as we could, we really did. It's nice to see the cleansing, if you believe this, that trauma can be cleansing. And that the truth came out. And yes, Don screwed up Peggy's relationship. She thinks he's a monster. He almost screwed up the company. He got fired from his job. He really, we will find out when we come back for season 7, hit rock bottom. And there he is, actually making some progress in his life, because those are the people in his life. His marriage, wow. It was fun, by the way, to accurately, whatever people's hopes were for the romance between Don and Megan, or hopes against it, because people think he should be with Betty or whatever, which always floored me, because it clearly was such a terrible marriage. They're so beautiful together. It's a TV thing. It's the TV thing versus the reality thing. They ignore, and they don't even, they have a rosy remembrance of how it went. And if you recall, in season 6 is the one where Betty sort of gets to regain her confidence completely by rejecting Don again, by sleeping with him and rejecting him again. And I think that in this Following the Inferno, that Don learned a lot about himself by going through hell. And that's kind of what we wanted to do, and come out the other side in some form of paradise.